Hello and welcome to episode 3 of Diary of a Folk Witch. My name is Zanna and I'm a practicing priestess, doula and animistic folk witch living here in Lancashire. Here I will share with you a blend of essays and diary entries that allow you to peer into the very real world of a modern practicing traditional style folk witch and wise woman. You are invited into my innermost world of actual everyday living witchcraft, everything from folklore to foraging, herbalism to urban homesteading, divination, spiritual practice and more. I don't niche down here, you see it all. Because I'm not just a witch when I'm performing workings, it's in every area of my life and you get to share that with me. Diaries are supposed to be places where we document our deepest secrets, but I believe some secrets are worth sharing, so let me share my life with you. Hello and welcome to episode 3 of Diary of a Folk Witch. My name is Zanna and today I'm going to be sharing with you 10 ways you can explore folk witchcraft today. There seems to be an abundance of different style witchcraft practices these days. There is traditional coven-based Wicca, solitary Wicca, kitchen witchcraft, half witches, green witches, hedge witches, grey witches, earth witches and chaos witches. There are hereditary witches and new witches, trad witches and folk witches. There are more witches than you can shake a broomstick at, and this list is by no means exhaustive. However, today I'm going to be talking to you about just one of these branches of witchcraft, and that is my own practice of folk witchery, sometimes also referred to as traditional style witchcraft. There are some semantics and preferences in the occult world as to whether traditional witchcraft and folk witchcraft are the same thing. For this blog, I will make the argument that both practices are much the same thing, or at the very least, are two sides of the same coin. Some may refute this, and if this is the case, that's absolutely fine, each to their own. But for the sake of this blog, I will be treating them as much the same flavour of practice. For example, both seek guidance and influence and inspiration from an older strain of magical practice, a magic that in many ways often predates the modern revival that is neo-paganism, and one that often takes a direct influence from regional folklore, spirits of the land, history, culture and politics. Though it is perhaps prudent to point out that just because many seek inspiration or influence from older practices that predate the neo-pagan boom of the mid-20th century, it in no way makes them antiquated practices or directly descended from some older lineages, though it is entirely possible that there is a small smattering of examples where this may be the case. For the most part, however, today's folk witchery or folk ways are entirely modern and individual to the practitioner and what influences, modern or historic, they choose to draw upon. Perhaps one marked difference from folk magic and traditional witchcraft is that not everyone who practices folk magic will necessarily identify with the term witch, where those who practice traditional style witchcraft will more often than not identify as so. In the case of folk witches or folk workers, to mindfully choose not to directly identify with the term witch, it's especially true if that individual is part of a religion such as Christianity. In this case, I have noticed that those who make use of what would perhaps usually be referred to as sympathetic magic, or herb wisdom and community care, tend to, instead, title their practice as folk ways or granny ways. This is particularly common for Catholic practitioners like my mother, or others that I have met here in Lancashire, a county, along with its historic counterparts of Manchester, Greater Manchester and Merseyside, that are still viewed to be a Catholic stronghold even today. You see, despite being perfectly legal to identify as a witch, many here in Lancashire have been brought up with some reservations of doing so. The echo of the 1612 Pendle witch trial still lingers thickly in the air, and as one older local witch I spoke to stated, you might not be hung for being a witch, but you were still brought up knowing that you could be shunned or at risk of losing your house or your job, especially in the case where many miners' houses were rented through their profession. In the eyes of Christianity, or indeed any other monotheistic religion, witchcraft is still very much seen as a sin or compact with the devil, as opposed to the genuine spiritual practice it really is. a practice that realistically can be teamed up with any faith or spirituality. There are a myriad of paths that may lead one to discover and pursue folkways, each as valid and as interesting as the next. For me personally, I first came to folkways via my mother and grandmother, and this later led me to explore both modern witchcraft and druidry. Like some of the practitioners I mentioned earlier in this podcast, neither my mother or grandmother seriously identified with the term witch. Sure, they would joke and tease, my mother saying that she was the witch of Croydon and my nan chortling back that she was the witch of New Addington, both suburbs in Greater London where I grew up before moving to Lancashire, but neither seriously ever used the term witch. Together they kept a firm distance from the obvious practice of witchcraft and its negative associations, and simply referred to their subtle practices as ways and means, or rubus ways, family terms that basically references folkways or sympathetic magic. I grew up not only watching this fascinating folkways of my maternal line, but I also displayed an intense interest and instinctual draw to all things witchcraft, folklore, and nature. Where many fellow teenagers were discussing boy bands or local trends, I was more often than not walking the North Downs, local woodlands, and learning to understand the natural landscape around me. When I would holiday with my nan and her partner twice a year in the West Country, I would spend all of my holiday pocket money on little regional folklore books and ghost stories. I remember one store in Chagford on Dartmoor in Devon. I must have spent most of my money in just one afternoon. Afterwards, as we drove up to the Warren House Inn, instead of engaging with the general chit-chat of other family members, my nose was planted firmly into the books about the devil on Dartmoor, or learning about ghosts, fairies, and myths around the local stones and places of power on the moors. This initial introduction to both the folkways of my family and a self-exploration of folklore is what slowly but steadily led me down the path of witchcraft. Thankfully, my mother fully supported me. She bought me my first tarot deck, taught me numerology, how to place wards for protection, and so on. For just because she never used the term witch to identify herself, she still knew her craft. When I finally walked away from the Catholic faith of which I had grown up in, and taken part in the typical rites of passage such as baptism, First Holy Communion, and Holy Confirmation, and publicly jumped headfirst into what many now refer to as either traditional witchcraft or folk witchcraft, no one in my family was particularly surprised, though my mother did caution me that any path containing folkways or witchcraft should also have a faith alongside it. "It's your anchor," she explained. I didn't understand it at the time, or why she clung to her Catholicism so strongly, but I was young and perhaps a little arrogant. It was only in my early 20s, when I discovered druidry, that did I realise the benefits of having a spiritual practice or faith alongside the practice that is witchcraft. For me, druidry has become my anchor, philosophy and spirituality. It complements my witchcraft practice and allows my spiritual life to thrive. You see, I am one of the many witches who views witchcraft as a practice and not a religion. Therefore, witchery has the potential to be paired alongside any faith. For some, that faith will have a pagan flair as mine does. For others, they may be Christian, agnostic, Hindu, and so on. And I speak about this in more detail in a blog titled "What is Folk Witchcraft?" and you can find this over on the website diaryofafolkwitch.com. My search and eventual formation of the folk witchcraft of which I now practice today is by no means validated by being some sort of arcane practice, handed down by generations before me. No, it's entirely a blend of both new, well sought out and researched inspirations gleaned from the many native influences of my Anglo-Irish heritage, as well as what was handed down to me via established family folkways. However, this does not make my practice any less authentic. If anything, perhaps it makes it more authentic because I both live it and share it with no delusions of grandeur or false claims of antiquity. where indeed some of my practice stems from my family's folk ways that previous generations of my family practiced. This forms only one portion of my craft and its influence. And although I acknowledge a familiar custom of sorts, I'm not naive enough to think that this is some kind of ancient or unchanged lineage of practice. One thing I have noticed with family units who participate in folkways or witchcraft is that each generation adds its own flair and flavour. This means the craft that I practice today is subtly different to my mother's established ways, and in turn, her practice also demonstrated differences to her own mother's practice, and so on. This is why I'm always slightly incredulous when people announce their craft stems from some form of ancient and unchanged lineage. Humans evolve, cultures and what influences those cultures flux and change also, and the same is true with folkways and witchcraft. So where I acknowledge some influence from my family folkways and Catholic folk magic, I also fully embrace that the rest of my practice has either been created by myself, influenced by regional folklore, customs, social politics, music and history, or learned from other local, often older wise folk and witches. Or sometimes it's even been channeled from the landscape and spirits of the land. This makes my path my own, and I love and embrace it. As witches and folk workers, we should be able to choose to formulate our own craft as well as follow others if we want to. For those of you who wish to formulate your own path and independently explore folk magic, I offer to you this podcast and the following tips that it gives. I have now been a practicing witch for over 20 years, and today I would like to share with you 10 ways in which you too may explore folk witchcraft for yourself and perhaps even formulate a practice of your very own. Tip number 1. Explore regional folklore and folk tales. No matter where you live in the world, there is likely to be an abundance of local folklore, folk tales, customs and ghost stories. Taking time to explore these is not only fascinating, but gives you an invaluable insight into the older beliefs and customs of your area. As well as this, local lore is absolutely teeming with indicators of older land spirits you may be able to work with. Folk tales often give subtle insights into local tree, plant and witch lore too. For example, here in Lancashire, a county that I have come to know very well over the last 11 years, there are some fascinating tales that offer glimpses into older preventative and apopatreic magical practices. For example, in the book Goblin Tales of Lancashire by James Bowker, there is a tale called All Hallows Night. It tells the story of a farmer and his employed labourer who have to do battle against the powers of evil in the form of the notorious Pendle witches atop of Pendle Hill. The story makes reference to horseshoe magic and mountain ash likely being a reference to rowan, as it's referenced in multiple other local tales and grows abundantly in the region. These were used for the protective magic against the powers of evil and witchcraft, though it should be noted that both these methods in the story used for preventative magic seem useless, and eventually the farmer and his labourer have to climb Pendle Hill and confront the powers of evil themselves. This story also makes reference to the old custom of leeting. Others have leeted the witches and thereby secured a 12 months immunity from harm. This is a clear reference to the old and still continued custom of leeting. You can read more about this custom in a previous blog that I wrote called Leeting the Witches and Soul Cakes, Haunting Traditions of Lancashire. So you see, folklore and folk tales are a wealth of subtle indicators towards folk magical customs and offer an invaluable peek into witchcraft and apopatreic ways of old. Tip number 2. Explore regional witchcraft. In extension to tip number 1, it's also ideal to specifically explore local regional witchcraft, because even on a small island such as Britain, you might be surprised at how witch lore and practice can vary from county to county and country to country. For example, where Wales, England and Scotland may share the same island, Their cultures, languages, mythos, and witch lore can vary greatly. Even within England, where I currently live, regional folklore can vary greatly from county to county. For example, in my 20s, I spent about 5 years living in Suffolk, East Anglia. Now, where there may be lots of similarities between East Anglian witchcraft and Lancashire witchcraft, there are also marked differences, especially within apopatreic magic. An example of this would be witch bottles. These are commonly found deposited in the foundations of buildings all over the southeast of England, and this is likely because of culture and trading. After all, the Bellarmine jugs came from Europe, and most European trade came into the ports of southern England. Traditional Bellarmine witch bottles are just not that common at all up here in the northwest of England. Instead, different apopatreic workings occur, such as scrubbing one's front step with wood ash from the wood burner. Wood burners are still a common feature in many homes here in the northwest of England. The hanging of horseshoes, rowan crosses, and curtain magic is practiced. Curtain magic is a sympathetic method of washing one's neck curtains, often but not always in vinegar and rose water or holy water to bring the home protection and stop the evil eye peering into the home. If you would like to read more about curtain magic, please feel free to head over to the website and check out the blog, the Grimoire series Granny's Curtains. Apparently, in parts of Manchester and Liverpool, it's not only seen as grubby to not keep your nets clean, but as an insult. One local witch and friend once told me that she could remember older women in the community bickering in the street, and phrases such as "go and clean your curtains, you mucky moo," was not just a scathing insult, but was also a warning that your ways had been noticed. This practice of curtain magic may cross over with other traditions, but I must admit that it was not one I personally encountered while living in Suffolk. You can explore regional witchcraft by talking to older members of the witch and pagan communities. You may even be lucky enough to be one of those people who seem to have a bit of a habit of naturally crossing paths with local wayside witches. I have found that talking to older members of the community not only offers an interesting pre-neo-pagan insight into local witchery, but also gives the opportunity to potentially preserve some older lore that otherwise may end up being forgotten. I have spent the last 5 years researching and documenting local folklore and folkways specifically in order for it to not be forgotten. Another potential avenue of exploration is to look at hashtags on social media, such as regional witchcraft, or even the Regional Witchcraft Challenge, which I believe was initially started by an Instagram account by the name of Via Hedera. Exploring local regional witchcraft will serve as a huge inspiration in the formation of your own practice. Tip number 3, folk music. Okay, this might sound a little bit random, but it actually makes sense when you think about it. Folk music can also serve as an inspiration into your practice and the connection you have to your local landscape. As well as this, it can give a valid insight into the culture of your area. Some folk songs will directly talk about local politics, ghost stories, history, and even folklore. One of the things I like to do when visiting a favourite working spot in the Pendle area is to hum the tune of the Pendle folk song. Now, don't worry, I'm not going to sing that for you here today, but it's one of those things that gets me into the mindset of working with the land and connecting with the folk magic and folkways. It's a song that directly references both the landscape and the Pendle witches. You may also like to write your own spell songs, which is a growing folk and pagan witch practice inspired by both old folk magic ways of humming magic and of course modern books and music like the Lost Word spell songs. For an example of a modern spell song, you might like to check out the Lost Words Blessing, or you can even check out a previous blog of mine on the topic titled A Spell Song for Pendle. Tip number 4, regional history and politics. Yeah, I know. For many, there is often a big eye roll at the mention of politics, and I can't really blame you. However, despite the fact that most of us are fed up to the back teeth with what seems to be a universally bad, capitalist-based and unsustainable politics of today, it cannot be denied that politics does impact every area of our lives, and always has done. Witchcraft in itself could be argued as being an act of political rebellion. After all, here in Britain, the last remnants of the Witchcraft Acts were not repealed until 1951. For many of us, that's parents' or grandparents' lifetimes. Even then, it was replaced with the Fraudulent Mediums Act. This act was repealed in 2008 and was replaced with the Consumer Protections and Unfair Trading Regulations of 2008. All of this occurring within what, for many of us, is living memory. There are, of course, those who will argue with me and say that witchcraft is not political, and I would have to politely but firmly disagree with them. So yes, the last of the official Witchcraft Acts were repealed in 1951. We all know that. However, it was replaced with subsequent acts, and it's these acts that often impact witches and occultists today. For example, if I wanted to set myself up as a tarot reader or perhaps some kind of oracle or intuitive reader, I would nearly always have to legally say before selling the reading that this is for entertainment purposes only, and this is because of the subsequent regulations that were brought in after the repeal of the Witchcraft Act of 1951. Largely these things come under the Consumer Protections Act and Unfair Trading Regulations of 2008. So yeah, witchcraft is political, it always has been, and unfortunately it probably always will be. Regional history and politics may throw up some interesting links when forming your own folk witch practices. For example, were there any witch trials in your area? What specific charges were brought against those supposed witches? Are there any surviving trial documents that may hint at specific witch practices? Did a historical event such as this impact local practice? For example, here in Lancashire, many who practice non-neo-pagan influenced folkways still do so discreetly, either as solitary practitioners or in family units, due to the still felt fallout of the notorious Pendle witch trials. What about class structure, business and poverty? Did these influence regional witchcraft in your area? Another Lancastrian example would be that of the function of goodwives, who were still operating until the birth of the NHS in 1948. These goodwives would be local folk workers who would help women in labour, and today what we would probably now call a birth doula, such as myself. These goodwives would also simultaneously support grieving widows who had lost spouses in mining accidents. In industrial areas, you will often find folk magic practices, such as rules about not putting new shoes on tables in case it invites death, or handkerchief customs. Though not from Lancashire, the custom of men keeping their wives' handkerchief in their pocket was to ensure that they would return home safely from the pits. Unfortunately, mining accidents were once very commonplace in the north of England, so superstitions around knockers, shoes, and keeping charms that were gifted from loved ones close by to ensure you got home safely were fairly commonplace. This particular handkerchief custom was passed down to me by my maternal grandfather, whose father worked in the pits in and around Tyne and Wear in the northeast of England as a reserved occupation during World War II. He later moved to London because he explicitly did not want his two sons working down the pits, the way in which he had been forced to. As well as this, goodwives in the north of England also served as lay healer, herbalist, and what we would now perhaps call death doula. She would wash the dead and prepare them for their funerals. Politically speaking, Lancashire has had a lot of contentious issues around, from an entirely modern perspective, fracking. Fracking has been a huge political issue over the last few years here in Lancashire. As such, many local witches, pagans, and conservation activists have teamed up to protest this unsustainable and frankly dangerous practice. So it might be worth you having a good old rummage through your local history and politics to gain a deeper understanding of the influences that may factor into your own path. Tip number 5. Explore places of power and your natural local landscape. No matter where you live, be it in a sprawling suburban jungle, a towering city, the countryside or by the sea, Your local landscape will have a lot to share with you and how it influences your practice. Before settling down here in Lancashire, I moved about a lot, and I mean it, I really did move about a lot. I've lived in London, Berkshire, I've lived in Ireland because that's where a lot of my family are from. I've lived in Suffolk and I've lived in Surrey. And every time I would move, the first thing I would always do was head off and explore the local terrain. I would observe what plants and trees grew locally, and therefore what I might be able to forage for either food, medicinals, or as ingredients as tools and workings. I would wander off and spend hours walking in local woodlands, downs, coastal paths, moors and forests. In doing so, I would acclimatise myself to the area and build a natural relationship with the land. I would make it my intention to visit places mentioned in folklore literature or urban legends, places of power or lonely liminal spots, such as bridges and corpse roads. In doing this, I not only quickly learnt my way around, but had an opportunity to get acquainted with local land spirits who may act as allies. Though not all. Where many local spirits are more than willing to amiably work with you, there are those who do not take kindly to your presence and will make that known, so please exercise caution, common sense, and a well-practiced foundation in both psychic and magical protection. Over the years, so much of my practice and the workings I have formulated have come directly from the inspiration gained from the walking the landscape and working with it, not against it. There is sometimes an assumption that a spell or working must be as old as time itself, something passed down through generations or some sort of ancient grimoire, and yes, where some older workings I have done have had a desirable or fascinating outcome, my most powerful workings, rituals and experiences have come from what my local landscape inspired within me. There can be an intense power from both spontaneity and intuitive workings. Sometimes these inspirations came from within my own creativity, or from the sights I saw, plants I chanced to see while walking, or spirits I encountered. Connecting with your local landscape is probably the most empowering and enjoyable thing you can ever do. It's all very well reading books on witchcraft and learning to identify some plants and trees from books, but really getting out there and really experiencing the land and its energies for yourself is the best teacher you will ever have. I think the wonderful Doreen Valiente had it right when she said, and quote, "I'd say to a person who really wanted to know what was the spirit of witchcraft, that they'll learn more by, say, going out on the downs at midnight and listening to the wind in the trees and looking at the full moon. They'll learn more of the spirits of witchcraft, the real spirits of witchcraft, in that way than they'll ever learn by reading any amounts of books." Tip number 6. Connecting with the spirits of the land. In extension to the previous mentioned, working directly with spirits of the land will also have a beneficial effect on one's practice. I fully appreciate that for those who may be new to their path, connecting with or communicating with local land spirits may seem a little advanced or even intimidating, but remember, this isn't an aspect you have to rush or do right away. Connecting with local land spirits can be as gradual a process as you want it to be, that's built up over time, not days. The purpose of reaching out and forming an amicable or friendly relationship with land spirits is twofold. It helps you form new and powerful allies that can positively influence and help your workings and rituals, as well as deepening your relationship to the landscape around you. Simple ways of forming connections with local land spirits is to explore the landscape and potentially leave safe, earth-friendly and biodegradable offerings, such as milk and honey, seeds, organic bread, flowers and so on. If this does not appeal to you, or you are unable to do it, you could try to do safe energy exchanges instead. One example of this is when I visit a local brook or a particular stone. I ask permission to send it energy, and if they agree, I send them Reiki or other such energy healings. In return, they share energy with me or information that can be psychically downloaded. This is a fairly common practice for folk witches who hold animistic beliefs, for we see the life and sacredness in all things. Everything in nature has a spirit and can be communed with if one knows how. Tip number 7. Learn to identify local plant life. Where it cannot be denied that we live in an age of convenience, and many witch supplies are now available at the click of a button, this has the added downside of somewhat alienating many practitioners from their local landscape. At the risk of sounding like an occult snob, and I honestly don't mean to, it does always surprise me when some practitioners cannot even identify the most common of trees or plants, and instead rely on internet shopping when they could easily go and cheaply forage for themselves. It does take time and dedication to safely learn tree and plant identification, and to forage safely and responsibly, and I openly admit to still being a student of the land and its green life, and that it does also help to have a husband who works in conservation who can identify most growing things and so help me with my learning. But taking the time to learn some basic and, if possible, extensive plant knowledge will pay in dividends. It means that instead of ordering some white mountain sage for seining, or if it's culturally appropriate to use smudging, you can perhaps go and find a native substitute instead. Here in England, I like to use mugwort instead of mountain sage, not only because it's a native plant, but it grows so heavily in abundance every summer. Responsible foraging from a local landscape increases your connection and bond with the land. You learn your terrain and other plants that you may not need on that day, but might need on another occasion. I can't tell you the amount of times I've needed a plant or a branch or something or other, and suddenly remembered seeing it on a previous excursion along the canal or in the woods or growing at a disused industrial estate, and so on. This connection and understanding the landscape adds a new level of personal power to any working you are doing. For using locally sourced items is another way of drawing upon the sacred energy that lies all around you, as well as the knowledge and experience within yourself. It also costs less and heavily reduces both one's carbon footprint and reliance on capitalism. Tip number 8. Think about potentially incorporating both your ancestry and ancestral veneration into your practice. For the folk witch, there is an obvious lean towards our local landscape and regional ways. However, there is a secondary connection that many of us look to as well, and that is our ancestry and the ancestors themselves. As an individual, I am Anglo-Irish. I am both English and Irish, and my DNA is predominantly Irish, then Scottish, with a little Welsh and Scandinavian thrown in. I am extremely proud of my Celtic origins, and am aiming to move back to Ireland in the next 2 years. I work heavily with Irish deities, such as Brigid, Danu, Dagda, Bive and the Morrigan, as well as Manannan, though Manannan also has obvious links to the Isle of Man too. My maiden name is Irish, and my husband and I have gifted most of our children with either first or middle Gaelic names. Other family links go to Scotland, with my father being directly descended from Scottish Highlanders on his father's side, some of whom were supposedly Jacobite rebels, as well as others being loyalists to the crown. Could you imagine how confusing and frustrating that would have been at the time, having both loyalists and Jacobites in the family? Families certainly are complicated things, and our ancestors are often no less complicated, but it is possible to work with them. Because of my ancestry and the kinship and connection I feel to the cultures of my ancestors, I have made a concerted effort to allow these cultures to influence my practice. I study Irish fairy lore, language and witchcraft. I still observe some of the old Irish folkways passed down to me by both sides of my family. For example, the covering of mirrors when someone has died, or the marking of the soda bread with a cross in order to let the fairies out who might have got caught in the harvesting of the wheat. I am actively trying to learn both Irish and Welsh languages, although I must admit that I seem to be doing far better with my Irish than I am my Welsh, but it's not for the lack of trying. I actively call to my ancestors through veneration and remembrance. If you're looking to pursue folk witchcraft, you may also enjoy looking towards your ancestors and cultural ancestry for connection and inspiration. Consider looking into your family tree. Where do your ancestors come from? Have they travelled a lot, as mine have done in the last 2 generations? Largely for work purposes, of course, as was common with Irish people travelling around England and America for better opportunities. If so, why did your family travel? Perhaps your family have been in and around one location for generations. If so, how does this affect your practice? And does it deepen your connection to the land? Or is it irrelevant to you? Ask yourself how you might work with your ancestors or ancestral cultures and how this might be able to inspire and bolster your practice. Tip number 9, create your own path. There are a lot of tedious and quite frankly arrogant people out there who like to tell you how you should, can or can't practice witchcraft. To these people, quite honestly, I offer them an eye roll and a gesture including my middle finger. Witchcraft has and hopefully always will be an expression of the self and based upon an individual's needs and the influence and inspiration from the world around them, the culture and the politics they are submerged in, and why it is that they practice the craft in the first place. As such, an individual seeker's path is their own. And yes, where there are certainly formalised paths out there where if you were part of it, you would naturally be expected to act within the parameters of that practice or lineage, outside of that practice, that person, witch, priest, priestess, etc., has no jurisdiction over your practice. If you are a solitary practitioner, you can practice your craft in any way you want to, and that is your right. Some will try to inform you that you must adhere to the harm none ethos or the threefold law, or that you must work with the chakra system. Personally, I think Hinduism and other faiths and cultures have been misappropriated enough over the years without me adding to it. That's not to say I'm opposed to working with other cultures. I just dislike how colonialist white culture has misappropriated other spiritual practices and only learnt about it on a watered down or superficial level. You may even be told that you must train in this or that, or you must be initiated. It's all gatekeeping nonsense. Formulate a practice and path that you resonate with, not one that will please or impress others. Don't be afraid to go your own way with your craft. You have to live it, not those around you. And if they don't like it, that's their problem. Tip number 10. Consider creating your own tools from what you have to hand. It's certainly no lie that modern witch and pagan communities have an abundance of craftspeople and artists who make absolutely phenomenal tools. I have to admit that for me personally, I'm a little bit in love with the journals and grimoires created by Earthworks Journals, and I'll see if I can pop a link into their business at the end of this podcast. Everything from scrying bowls and oracle decks to wands and staffs can now be found online or at pagan events that hold stalls. And while I will always have a soft spot for supporting small businesses and artists, there is nothing quite like making your own tools. These very well may be slightly crude when you first get going, but as you persevere and add to your arsenal, you will find that your tools get more refined and simply sing with power. Over the years, I have made or been gifted charms from locally sourced hagstones, wands from local trees, collected bones found while out walking to form what will be a divination set, and have handcrafted boggart effigies created from local wood by a loved one. Each piece has its own energy and adds yet another layer of power into how you connect and marry with the land in which you live. Eat, sleep, make love, laugh, and practice your craft. So please, if you get the opportunity, make something from your natural landscape. It might just be that you have 2 shells and you use them as prayer anchors, or you might find a branch of hazel on the ground that you want to make into a staff or a wand. Give it a go. You can't really go wrong, because even if it's slightly crude looking at the start, it's still yours. It's your connection to the landscape and part of your tools within folk witchcraft. And like I said, the more you practice, the better you will get. Thank you so much for tuning in today and supporting another podcast. If you'd like to read more of my work, you can head on over to the website diaryofafolkwitch.com, where you will find a blend of both free and premium content blogs. The premium content subscription costs £4 a month and gives you access to 2 exclusive blogs a month, as well as access to the private Facebook group. Blogs alternate, meaning you always get varied and in-depth content, and they run by series, so they alternate between the Spirits of the Land series, the Tree and Plant Lore series, the Folk Witchcraft series, the Grimoire series, the Divination series, and the Animal Familiars and Spirit Guide series. So please feel free to go and check that out if you want to. From the time, mists, and distance between us, blessings from me to you.